So today I'm going to talk to you about a question. Will ChatGPT eliminate more jobs than it creates? And I'm not going to give you like a very technical quantitative assessment. One of the things I want to do is I want to raise a note of skepticism about the way that social scientists have tried to answer this question. So, you know, I have a kind of side job now as a kind of professional tech skeptic. And I'm going to kind of talk to you from that perspective. But I'm going to do it by saying I really don't know what's going to happen with ChatGPT. I think it's very hard to predict the future, and I'm going to note along the way that a number of other tech skeptics are starting to, you know, like the characters in the anime sci-fi movie Paprika. They're starting to kind of take off their critical hats and join the dance of automation excitement. And so I'm still not doing that, but I want to hopefully have a good conversation about it. So earlier this year, researchers at OpenAI, the makers of ChatGPT, put out a paper claiming that generative AI was likely to eliminate 49% of jobs. And their kind of marker for this, they were estimating what percentage of tasks for any job these types of generative AI systems could take over, and they put the marker at 50%. They said any job that could be done, where 50% of the tasks could be done by generative AI, likely in the future, they marked for elimination, and on that basis they said 49% of jobs likely to disappear in the future. And in doing this, they basically copied the methodology of an earlier paper by Carl Benedict Frey and Michael Osborne that came out first as a working paper in 2013, which put that number just slightly below. They said 47% of our jobs are likely to be eliminated by AI and robots, especially we were focused on robots at that time. And this was the paper that really kicked off a wave of automation hype. I should say, I forgot to mention that Sam Altman just a few weeks ago upped his estimate. He said 80% of all jobs were likely to be eliminated by generative AI, which is an incredibly high number. But I want you to just notice that there's a certain structure to this argument, which has to do with this idea that we can measure jobs in terms of tasks. We can estimate the percentage of these tasks that can be taken over by a given computer system. And then on that basis, there's some threshold above which jobs are eliminated. And I just think this is an incredibly bad methodology that has had no results. It has had zero capacity to predict what would happen. So did work disappear? Here is the incredible thing. And you know, when we look at, Julie Shore noted yesterday this paper by Asimoglu Restrepo, trying to analyze in like really great detail with the best tools of you know, economics today, whether robots actually are reducing employment in manufacturing. The way of doing that analysis masks what's going on at the aggregate level that is so crazy, it's amazing to me that it isn't a bigger story. So this is just, if you go look on Fred, which is this incredible economic statistics database online, you can just pull up manufacturing sector productivity. And what you'll see, this incredible statistic, that the decade when robots were supposed to take over the manufacturing sector, it's not just that they overhyped the case. It's not that robots increased productivity somewhat, but you know, less than what was expected. This was actually a decade of falling productivity in manufacturing for workers. And sometimes people don't understand how these statistics are constructed. You might think, oh, this is a measure of the marginal productivity of labor. This is showing that robots are doing more of the work than workers. No, this is average labor productivity. This is just output produced divided by number of hours worked. If robots were replacing workers, that should lead this number to go up really high, really fast. Instead, it's not just that it didn't grow that fast. There's been a historic break in trend where instead of growing more quickly in manufacturing than in other sectors, labor productivity essentially stagnated and began to fall in the manufacturing sector in the era when it was supposed to be advancing most quickly. Very few of the people who've made these big claims about how technology was going to transform work have done any self-evaluation at the end of the decade to see how their predictions panned out. The one exception that I found is the OECD. So in 2021, the OECD asked the question, what percentage of jobs actually disappeared? You know, they had a much lower estimate. They said 14% compared to Frey and Osborne's 47%. They said that despite this prediction, employment grew in every OECD country over this period. There's no decline in employment. And at the country level, countries that were assessed as having a higher risk of job loss from automation actually saw more job growth than countries that were assessed at a lower risk. And you'll note, you know, it says at the occupational level, employment growth was lower in occupations that had a higher risk of automation than in occupations at a low risk. That's an incredible statistic. It's saying that even in the jobs that this technique had suggested were going to decline, even in those jobs grew, but they grew by less than in jobs that weren't marked for high rates of automation. So I think this is really important just to add into the conversation, at least to look back at what happened over the last 10 years, and on that basis to kind of think about what might happen going forward. If we go back to this period when Frey and Osborne wrote this text, the mid-2010s, you know, why didn't this massive wave of job destruction that was predicted actually come to pass, and what does that tell us about what might happen over the next decade? In other words, we heard so many stories about robots and AI taking over jobs. Why didn't that happen, at least in the last 10 years? And then, you know, a little bit thinking forward about what that tells us. I'm not necessarily saying that because this failed in the last 10 years, it's necessarily going to fail in the next 10. But I think it's really important that the public and that we as scholars kind of assess the data and think about this question. So, you know, when you hear about the transformation, there's two main things you'll hear about. One is the evidence of the number of robots that are being taken up into employment. And something really important about this data, which you'll notice at the top, which isn't always mentioned, is that this measure from the International Federation of Robotics is just about manufacturing. It is not a measure of robots per worker in general, just in manufacturing. The reason is that there are so few robots in the service sector that they basically don't collect the statistics. And you know, you can see, like as expected, that countries in East Asia and in Northern Europe are some of the most roboticized. And the US is, I think, still somewhat behind the pack. The other thing that's frequently cited here is evidence of just the incredible decline in the price of robots. They've just become so much cheaper to buy robots. There's real economies of scale, there's developments in the production of robots that have seen real falling costs for the robots. So the question is, in spite of falling costs, in spite of this additional adoption of robots, why are we seeing such low productivity growth in manufacturing? And you know, when I wrote my book in 2020, was mostly just referring to the data showing that this was significantly less of a change than analysts had said, but in the past 10 years, we've learned a lot about what went wrong. And what the data shows, or what deeper kind of ethnographic analysis has shown, is that robots generally do a very small subset of tasks. And generally, when you evaluate what a robot does, the first question you should ask yourself is, does this robot move heavy things from place to place? Because what you'll find is that that is the main task that robots perform in the economy. If you go into an Amazon warehouse, you'll see the Kiva robots. What do? They move heavy things from place to place. That is a very small number of the total tasks in manufacturing. So there's other things robots do. They weld, they join together materials with high heat. But there's still the case that most of the robots being adopted are being used to do a very small subset of tasks. And it's not just that. The vast majority of robots are employed in a very small number of industries. So this is data from an analysis of robot adoption across all of Europe. And what it showed is that half of all of the robots that you see being purchased You know, think about why are there so many robots in Korea, in Japan? It's because a lot of them are in the automotive sector. Here again, this is for Europe, not East Asia. There's limited adoption in rubber and plastics and metals and food and beverage. That's basically food processing. But in general, the adoption of these robots is highly concentrated within the manufacturing sector. When you talk to people who study the adoption of robots in manufacturing, they generally say that the revolutionary transformation in robotics and industry happened in the 70s and 80s with computer numerically controlled production and then making that more advanced. Most analysts of the manufacturing sector say that today, and in general, production is highly automated, whereas assembly is much less automated within manufacturing. Most of the robots being adopted reproduce these trends, the existing trends. There's been no qualitative breakthrough from the perspective of most people who are analyzing it from the inside. Now, what about the falling costs of robots? Hasn't that really changed the game of their adoption? The thing you don't hear when you hear about that is that the cost of purchasing a robot is a tiny portion of the cost of implementation of a robot within manufacturing. 3/4 of the cost of implementing a robot is the cost of training that robot, of writing the programming for it, and then getting it to work in its place. I think that, as Lucas said yesterday in a more philosophical presentation, a lot of the use of these robots is about eliminating space for human judgment. And when robots work well, they work very fast. And as you can imagine, that requires a huge amount of work to calibrate a robot, to get it to work properly. And the thing about that is makes it very hard to use robots in manufacturing is that a lot of manufacturing processes require rapid change in how we produce things. A lot of manufacturing today, you can imagine in a world of just-in-time production, requires incredible flexibility and capacity to change up what we produce. In a world of flexibility, it's very hard to use robots to do that kind of work. So what researchers at MIT found when they went and studied robot use is that at small and medium enterprises within manufacturing, there are effectively almost 0 robots in use in manufacturing, which is an incredible statistic. The reason is that most small and medium enterprises, they're doing small batch production, they're changing production up frequently, and for that very reason, they're really unable to bring very many robots into production. Not only that, but the largest and most efficient automotive producer in the world, Toyota, has over the past 10 years removed robots from its assembly line rather than added them. That's not true of all automotive manufacturers. Volkswagen has been trying to roboticize production. But again, why is the most efficient producer, Toyota, taking them off the line? It's because Toyota needs, and especially in a changing environment, the rise of all these Chinese producers entering the market, they need more flexibility in production. And it's still the case that human beings are much cheaper when it comes to flexible production than robots. So what about in the service sector? These kinds of issues that exist in manufacturing are just much more extreme in the service sector. Basically, there's an incredible need for flexibility. There's a lot of adaptation. You're not doing the same exact thing over and over again at high speed. And precisely that need for customization, for rapid changeover, has radically limited the adoption of robots in services. There's also a lot of problems with limitations on battery life. Sometimes people say, what should you do if you're being chased by Spot the dog, that Boston Dynamics robot? Just try to make it for 90 minutes and the battery will die. So and maybe that's why the robot keeps disappearing in that Black Mirror episode. It needs to be recharged. So these are some real difficulties at the technical level with coming through on the robot revolution. That's important to know because maybe these things will be overcome in the future. But it's important to understand why those limitations are there. And again, I was saying before about manufacturing. Here's the productivity growth rate for the OECD as a whole over the past 50 years. And what you see is a really dramatic slowdown in productivity. And I just want to really mark that out, that we live in an age where we're being told that we're living in an age of incredible breakthroughs in productivity, that we have experienced now a qualitative shift to a new level of productivity growth. There's just no evidence that that is the case. In fact, the opposite is true. We live in a period of incredibly slow productivity growth. I've written about that. I could talk about why it's the case. Generally, I think that as we transition from an industrial economy to a service economy, there's just much lower potential for productivity growth in services, and that this transition and the kind of Baumol's cost disease effects, if you know that theory, have essentially swamped the effects of the adoption of technology. There has been technological change in some industries, but it's generally been swamped out by the effects of the transition to from high productivity growth activities to low productivity growth activities. Now, this isn't the whole story, and I think that in my book, I underemphasized a really important part of the story, which is that if jobs didn't disappear, how were they nevertheless transformed? And I think that when technologists and economists talk about how jobs are transformed through technology, they tend to overemphasize one part of the story, because it's true that companies make more money when they more efficiently produce income with the capital they have. When they're if you think about the efficient markets hypothesis, there is some truth to it. Obviously, there's bubbles, there's all this misallocation of capital, but on the whole, it is true that companies make more money when they put their investments in the places where it raises income the most, whether that's through product innovations or process innovations. But what that story doesn't tell us is that there's a second thing that really affects profit, which is the share of that income that goes to capital versus the part that has to be shared with workers. What percentage of the income these companies are generated is paid out in wages versus taken as profits. And what you find is that a lot of technologies can be used to shift income from workers to capital in a number of different ways. Some of these are on the borderline between efficiency gains and income shifting. But what I want to just say very quickly before diving into some of that is that we have stories about how technology changes jobs. The story over the last, 30 years or so has been what's called skill-biased technical change. It's kind of the assumption or the idea or the hope that as technology is implemented into jobs, workers, in order to use that technology, need more skills. And so as long as they can get those skills and get the education, their wages, what's demanded of them, and therefore also their wages, should rise in line with productivity growth. The other theory, kind of older theory, is like Taylorism. It's the idea that another possibility is that technologies are used to de-skill work, that technologies are used to make it possible to employ workers with lower skills who need to be paid less money in order to kind of take advantage of those possibilities. And that's the question, are wages rising in line with productivity, or is there a growing gap between wages and productivity? What we know is that over the past 50 years, at least in the US, there's been an extremely large gap between the rate of growth of productivity and wages. One big thing that I think we should think about when looking at the future is Uber. Now, Uber doesn't make any money, so it's hard to analyze them in profitability terms. But one thing that Uber did that really was a new technology that I think in some way potentially indicates a way to increase productivity is that they were able to use Google Maps to make it so anyone could drive a taxi. If you had a car and a license, you didn't need to know a city in the way that a taxi driver used to need to know a city. And that is a really important example of a kind of de-skilling that some digital technologies have made possible. But it's really important to note that this kind of Taylorism, this de-skilling effect of technology, is potentially very different today than the form it took in the past. In the past, Taylorism, the idea of de-skilling workers with technology, was associated with a real increase in middle layers of management that you needed to manage those workers. Whereas today, digital Taylorism automates a lot of management tasks. Uber doesn't have dispatchers, right, that it has to work with. It's able to automate a lot of the management tasks. And I should also say, if I have time, I'll mention this at the end, I think that there's a lot of potential for these technologies, precisely in the way Darrell West was saying, to flatten organizations. There's huge potentials for these technologies to eliminate managers that I doubt will be used to its full possibilities in the economy today. But this feature of digital Taylorism, that it's able to manage workers in a different way, slides over into something else, which is the use of technologies to shift income generated from workers to capital. And there's a bunch of theories about why it would be the case that these kinds of technologies could achieve this end. There's a popular economic theory. Janet Yellen was one of the people who put it forward. I'm actually very critical of it in a certain way. This efficiency wages theory, that when workers, when it's hard, the very short versions, when it's hard to figure out what workers are contributing, you have to pay them more money so that they do contribute more. That, the harder it is to measure how hard someone is working, the more you have to pay them in order to get an effort out of them. And there's a lot of problems with that theory, but some economists have talked about a kind of idea of not skill bias technical change, but power bias technical change, that it's possible to think about technologies being used, again, not to increase the productivity of workers, but to find ways to essentially reduce the efficiency wage and shift the income generated from labor to capital. And we're seeing technologies in the past 10 years use that in all kinds of ways. Sensors and monitoring programs that record all this information about workers, which can also be used to reorganize the process for maximum efficiency, can also be used just to lower the efficiency wage, the extra wage that has to be paid to workers who are hard to surveil. And the way that these technologies have been used both to do this shifting and to raise productivity, at least in the case of Amazon, they've been so successful as work intensifiers that Amazon had to build in these routine breaks and wellness rooms. This is someone going into this kind of enforced meditation room as a way of lowering chances of worker injury and to slow the pace of burnout. We've also seen a lot of these technologies used recently in trucking, where workers who used to be on the road very far from managers, very hard to watch over, are now wearing all of this like biosensitive wearable materials that are sending all this information back to the trucking company. So we're seeing all these examples. Again, it's hard to separate out these two things: the use of these technologies to intensify work and increase productivity versus the use of these technologies to affect a shift in the share of income that goes to capital rather than to labor. But the sum total of all of this is just to say that in aggregate, very few jobs have been destroyed completely. Many jobs have changed significantly over time due to technologies. Another really big thing that we've learned over the past 10 years about how this process happens is that there isn't any clear and exact way that a technology has to change work. The way that job tasks have evolved over time varies significantly by company and by country. So when people try to go in and do a deeper dive into what kinds of tasks are required to do a particular job, like what kind of tasks do you need to be a teacher, it turns out that in different countries and different companies, those tasks vary a lot, even within the same occupation. So a way to think about that is that what it requires to build a car, if you are at a Volkswagen or a BMW, the tasks required of workers in that field are very different from the tasks required of someone building cars at the very high-end Italian car producers like Ferrari and Lamborghini, and again very different from the less high-tech newer firms in China like BYD. What an assembly worker on one of these lines has to do literally there's very different tasks involved in the same kind of production. And what researchers have kind of said about this is that it seems from the evidence of this task-based analysis that technology shapes work in very different ways, depending on economic context, legal context, workers' unionization. All of these things really shape the frame within which technology develops, and hence the way that tasks of different jobs evolve. And I think the big lesson, the takeaway from the research, which I think you don't always get at the level of the way these things are talked about, is that technology doesn't develop inexorably. The way it shapes jobs is very context dependent. It has a very high political component. Now, I've been talking for a long time about the last 10 years. I haven't talked that much yet about ChatGPT, and I don't have that much time. So I'll be brief. So again, just thinking about how what happened over the last 10 years gets us to at least be skeptical in thinking about what these technologies can do. I won't say that much about what ChatGPT is like. You know that it's trained on very large amounts of data taken from the internet. I think that it seems to me to still be the case that ChatGPT is very good at essentially, like the way that Google Maps learns from traffic patterns, what are good ways to make your way through a city. ChatGPT, you can think of it as doing that for a much larger range of tasks, that based on a huge amount of data, they can figure out, in a sense, how certain kinds of skilled workers do their work, and then apply that to productivity enhancements, and I'll talk about that a little bit more. I want to note that, when you talk about how much these things are going to change the world, a lot of what I'm hearing from the startup world, this was a recent article in the Wall Street Journal, they're saying AI startup buzz is facing a reality check. A lot of these companies are actually having trouble finding viable applications for the technology. And there's been a number of prominent examples of tech company entrepreneurs saying, you know what, we're pivoting because we aren't actually able to do with these technologies what we thought we'd do. There are some indications, though, that there could be some big changes, and I don't know what to think of that. The thing that to me seems most important, you should know that companies have mostly banned the use of ChatGPT. It's a huge security risk. There's a lot of potential data leaks. But workers are using ChatGPT secretly within their jobs. And the BBC interviewed a whole bunch of workers who are going against company policy and surreptitiously using the technology to do their work. That indicates to me that there's some real potential for productivity growth. I also want to note, here's Tyler Cowen. Basically, just 2 days ago, the productivity releases came out, and they had said that GDP in the US rose by 4.9%, and productivity grew by 4.4%. That's huge, and how much of that, if you look at the big bump, that big bump in productivity is companies firing a lot of people during the pandemic and working the remaining workers a lot harder. So clearly we know that that first big bump had more to do with like a squeeze. But what they're referring to is this, increase in growth at the very end there. That could be significant. I really don't know how to think about it. Again, companies have banned the use of these things. It's not like they're being widely used across industry right now. So it could be other AI tools. It could be just that, the economy is running a little bit closer to full capacity and that raises productivity. I don't know, but Tyler Cowen, who's normally a stagnationist, has said, the great stagnation might be over. I should also note that in Nature just a few days ago, there was this article that they published that suggested a real breakthrough in AI that wasn't done by the OpenAI people. Basically that 2 researchers had figured out how to get neural networks to learn a lot more quickly, so they wouldn't need millions of examples of an iguana to identify an iguana, but maybe like hundreds of examples. And that would make a huge difference in what these technologies can do. So I think I should leave time for questions. I think what I want to say in general is I think there's a lot of potential for these technologies. If you just take the Google Maps Uber example, I think there's a lot of potential, which is worrisome in a way for workers without unions, in computer programming, in legal work. These are activities that have incredibly low rates of productivity growth. Historically, there might be some real bump in productivity. Graphic design, education. There's all these examples of jobs that have historically had very low rates of productivity growth where these technologies can make a difference. But the way they seem to make a difference when people have done on-the-ground studies is that they make it easier for lower skilled or less experienced workers to perform closer to average. They've had much less of an effect on the high skilled workers' production. And so what that indicates is a potential for tailorization and job polarization inherent to the technology. Another thing that these technologies might allow is they might make it possible for companies to gather information about how hard workers are working who were previously difficult to track. And again, that would affect a decline in, using this theory that I'm skeptical of in other ways, a decline in efficiency wages that could then shift income from workers to capital. And that's another way that these things might really affect jobs. And the message of the past 10 years that I think is the takeaway, again, I really don't know what's going to happen with ChatGPT, but it's useful to know what happened in the last 10 years, is that if it's the case that, as Sam Altman is saying this week, that jobs are going to disappear, there's no use in worrying about what it's like to do those jobs. So the last 10 years, we had a lot of these Silicon Valley companies saying, we're going to eliminate these jobs. And the effect is you say, oh, well, they're going away, so who cares what it's like to do those jobs today? In reality, those jobs stuck around. They changed in ways that were often pretty bad for workers and that shifted power from labor to capital. If that's what's happening, if jobs are changing, then it's really important how they change. It's really important what the legal frameworks are. It's really important what workers' power is. There's no reason that even if a job sees 50% of its tasks automated, we don't know from that at all whether the number of people doing that job is likely to grow or decline. Computer programming is very expensive. If it becomes cheaper, that might lead to more people working in programming, although at lower wages perhaps, than before. We just don't know. To extrapolate from task automation to job effects is just, I think mostly a fool's errand. And so, I think I'll stop there. I was going to say some things about the positive potential of these technologies around flattening workplaces. I think that there's a lot of, I think that people who are pointing out how companies are using these technologies to shift power to firm owners, that's really important work of showing what's going on. I think we as researchers should do more work to find the positive potentials and show optimistic scenarios of how these things could be used in a different environment to change work for the better. So I'll stop there, hopefully leaving a little time for questions.
So much. And Nir, can I ask you to run microphone duty so we can make sure that folks can hear? So we'll start with Lucas.
Thank you very much. It's amazing. Great presentation. I'll just say three things quickly and invite you to comment on any one of them. One was the thing about low productivity growth as a trend.
You went to the one?
Yeah. About the thing about low productivity growth as a trend. I wonder how much that is a function of how we're measuring productivity growth, especially in the service sector. So I started my job as an academic and I'm really terrible at teaching things, and 10 years later I'm considerably better and my students actually know some things when they leave, but of course that's never going to get picked up. And it seems to me like a lot of service sector occupations are like that, and that they don't go to the regular statistics. The second issue is the limited use of robotics in manufacturing is about flexibility and reprogramming, but don't the developments in machine learning and AI at least on the horizon potentially make that quite a lot cheaper just because compute capacities are high. And the third thing is about, it seems like one answer to the question of why there aren't so many robots yet is that the people are robots as the surveillance of their every bodily movement, second by second, is increasing, and then their movements are even directed second by second by the robots. So maybe we should be thinking about the person-robot interface as a study of increasing robotification of the labor process.
Great. Yeah. So productivity growth in services is notoriously very difficult to measure, and so one possible response is to say this is mostly a mismeasurement problem. If that were the case, then that would mean that our economy is growing. For the past 10 years was actually growing a lot faster than we thought, and things are just in general a lot better than they seem to be. And I think there are a bunch of reasons to think that that is not what's happening. I think that Robert Gordon said it best when he said, look, if you look at the past, if you look at the 100 years from 1870 to 1970, and you look at all of the incredible changes in people's lives, it was probably the case that the ways that productivity would be mismeasured in the service sector, the kinds of things people are pointing to, also would have applied to the incredible transformations that unfolded during those 100 years. The actual gains to income that come from having indoor plumbing in your house. These kinds of things were probably mismeasured, as it were, at least as extremely as things are today. So, Gordon, I think this is something we could debate about a lot. I think it's a technical question. But I think that the people who say the low productivity growth trend is real in services, I think that they're right. But I think it is a really big issue for discussion. And I think it's just still true, in education, that it's still the case. The basic measure is the more students you have as a teacher, the worse the quality of their education. And if that's the case, that's the basic measure, right? How many surgeries can a doctor perform? They might be getting more successful with the surgeries, so we can see some benefit that way. But are surgeons going from performing, 10 surgeries a week to 100 and then 1,000, because that's the kind of way that really big productivity growth happens. I think you could be right. Maybe if generative AI really makes it cheaper to do programming, and then that makes it possible to lower the cost of implementing robots, I think that could make a big difference. I think that it's still the case that a lot of the problems with implementing robots have to do with calibrating them, and so I think that's why I'm uncertain, right? Maybe these things are, maybe generative AI, and especially this breakthrough I mentioned from just a few days ago, maybe those are the things that are going to pull out the stopgaps to the transformation we were promised but didn't see. I remain really unsure, and I don't know. I don't like to predict the future. I mostly like to talk about how we got the past wrong. So I have to be very unsure about that. And I think that is the point. People, the fact that these technologies didn't deliver on productivity, what they did deliver on was the ability to make people much more robotic by invading, really I think that the idea that the surveillance technologies are mostly pushing buttons about are you satisfied with the person's work. I think if you look at how these things are being implemented in Amazon or on truck drivers, it's a much more invasive form of surveillance that's much more aimed at making people robotic. And again, I think about this kind of income shift from labor to capital that we've seen a lot of. So I think that that's to me that's a bigger danger, that, at least for the moment, than the jobs being eradicated.
So Julie is next, and then Brad.
Thanks. That was a great talk. Thanks so much. Two things I wanted to flag. One, you sort of came back to it a little bit later, and it's on the productivity question, which is, I think that for reasons economists, I think, don't really understand, or at least they didn't the last time I dipped into this literature, the macro context has a really big impact on productivity.
Yes.
And so you see in really rapidly growing economies, at least until right near the peak, just much, much higher productivity growth. And so I think just to sort of use the aggregate rates of productivity as measures of what exactly is happening at the micro level with the introduction of these technologies, to me it's not really that determinative. So it is a puzzle, and I also think from just remembering that first wave of sort of introduction of software into manufacturing, they had those big packages that they used to try and rationalize manufacturing. It just took them a long time to figure out how to do it. So I also think there are big lags in sort of how long, it's another kind of learning by doing thing. But these are issues that I think don't get enough attention in the literature, and this sort of basic model just assumes like a much more instantaneous kind of stuff gets put in and everybody gets to the frontier, as opposed to like, a much more variegated picture in terms of what's going on with productivity. I mean, I'm thinking about this in the context of the 4-day week stuff where, of course the economist was like, well, how could this possibly be happening, that there are all these, free lunches out there? Okay, so that's the first one. The second, on efficiency wages, I mean, as a person who started her career using efficiency wage models, I like them a lot more than you do. Surveillance, the cost of surveillance and the cost of the wage premium are the things that the firm trades off to figure an optimal amount. So yes, of course, in an era where the cost of surveillance is falling, we would expect firms to use more surveillance and less in the way of efficiency wages. But since you brought up the gig labor case, I just want to point out that there's a really interesting thing here, which is that because of the way the platforms have set up the labor force, which is that unlimited, open access and no control over hours of work. So they allow people to work very short hours, which means, and in some of these workforces, that's the dominant pattern, the dominant group. Those people have very low, what I call cost of job loss, or what the efficiency wage literature will call the employment rate, which is the value of the job compared to the next best alternative. That's what the wage is doing in those models. It's motivating behavior, discipline, intensity, and so forth. So you've got all these people in that world who have very low cost of job loss, very low employment rates. So it's kind of counter to that dominant view, which I think a little bit you were saying, which is, oh my, look at all this, they're degrading the wages. And what I found is that workers who are not dependent on the platform for their dominant source of income, or, i.e. who have a low employment rate, are much, much harder to discipline in those regards. And I really love your point about the management layers.
Yeah, so I really agree with the general point that the macro context has a big impact, and that one of the causes of stagnation is probably stagnation, right? That the fact that the economy has been growing more slowly for so long, in itself has led to less investment, less effort to kind of like figure out what we can do with technologies, and that was especially true probably in the kind of post-housing bubble era. And so, I think it's very hard to say, like this is what I feel very unsure about. We've seen, the indications are that the high interest rates are starting to have an effect, that, the next quarter's growth rate is not going to be anywhere near as high as it was. And there are still some economists, including very prominent economists influencing central bank policy, who do think that the stagnation story is likely to be the long term. I think we do need to, really severely pull back the growth rate. That productivity growth isn't going to rise that much into the future, and that they want to really damp down on labor demand. And so I just feel really unsure. I think that I think it is true that, you know, if you look at, I like what Gordon says about digitization. Like it did take a while, it then generated some effects, but again, the effects just weren't as big as the kind of boosters of this stuff set, that the history has been really gigantic overestimation. I've been wearing my Dow 10,000 hat, you know, or I got a beautiful replica of this. I don't know if you remember this, but when the Dow crossed 10,000 around the year 2000, you know, there were all of these people saying from 10 to 40, like we're on our way, Dow a billion, you know, like these technologies are going to be incredible. And the lesson each time is like a major gap, right, between potential and reality. So I think that we should, you know, we should be skeptical to start with. It could be totally true that these things are just, you know, in process and they're going to, you know, we're going to see them take off. It's totally possible that that's the case. I think it's also true, you know, as we saw with the metaverse, with crypto, that there's a huge amount of just, you know, hot money venture capital flows looking for the next big thing, hyping them up. One really interesting result was like McKinsey has been so on this tip of telling companies to fire their permanent workers and hire temporary workers. They went all in on AI is going to eradicate jobs, and you know they actually wrong-footed a lot of companies with those kind of suggestions. So there's a lot of players with an interest in overinflating these things, and that's why I think it's important to have some skepticism. On the gig stuff, you know, I'm totally with you on that, and I think that there are large sectors of the economy that have depended on a high degree of precarity. Like they depend on a pool of workers who can't find jobs elsewhere, right? Who are available to gig work. And I think like 5 years ago, you pointed out this phenomenon that as the unemployment rate fell, it was like harder for Uber to find and hire drivers, and they have to offer higher wages, and that's also why people are taking Ubers less because they become more expensive, right? And so I think that's also something that I, in my work, really emphasize, how much of the economy depends on this, you know, readily employable, low security workforce. And it all depends on how long this period of high employment lasts. Like, are we entering a long period of low unemployment rates? That could also have big effects on technology. So the field is open, but I still think we should, because of what happened in the last 10 years, it's good to have a little dose of reality. You know, I'm not saying that, the truth is, every 50 years so far, productivity has grown significantly. Job categories have changed significantly. Even if productivity growth drops from 2% per year to 1% per year, that can mean pretty big changes over the long term. But I think that there are a lot of reasons to still be skeptical.
Thank you, Haran. Next.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that interesting talk, and that was very insightful for me. And it just made me to wonder about if you have any specific thoughts about this online work, specifically on the gig work again. So, to your big question around like how this ChatGPT is eliminating or creating jobs, particularly for these online platforms where, you know, like white collar jobs are getting outsourced, and where people like do this knowledge work on these online platforms. So I'm just curious to learn more if you have any specific thoughts about that implication on these online work. It's a really quick question.
Yeah. I mean, you know, one thing that's really interesting is like that's another example where workers seem to be using these tools surreptitiously. So, you know, there was recently a really interesting academic article about how academic researchers are relying on these kinds of microtasking websites to do surveys and get information. But as microtasking workers are not doing the work themselves and relying on ChatGPT to provide answers, it means that, you know, the research effort to use these things to learn about the world is really, that potential is being eradicated. So, but that indicates, again, that where workers are able to use these tools without, surveillance revealing that they are, it's having an effect. And I think that particularly in jobs where people, or for tasks where people have to produce texts or images, that these kinds of things will make a big difference. I think that, to me, the problem with, I think the focus on gig work is really important because it's been a real growth area. My concern is that, the technologies we're seeing now are likely to really step out of the gig field, right? That like the way that companies were able to use digital technologies to create platforms in the past decade is really important. But I think that the way that technologies like ChatGPT is going to transform work, that's going to happen now a lot more like at corporations, in other kinds of spaces. And to me, I think the trick for researchers will be to take what we've learned about how labor has changed in the gig economy and look at how now jobs outside of the gig economy might change in ways like that model of Google Maps, having this de-skilling effect. I think those kinds of things being applied outside of the platform economy is likely to be a major place of change.
You describe yourself as a professional tech skeptic. I want to push you on a counter to that and offer a vision in which just because disruption has been delayed, it doesn't mean it's never going to happen. And I guess my remarks are best summed up by the argument of Daniel Susskind in his book A World Without Work, which I still believe is the best book on technological unemployment, why it will happen sooner or later and how we need to get ready for it. So in my professional career, I saw smartphones being delayed, and skeptics said they're never going to happen. But eventually the ecosystem got strong enough and people learned how to build apps and how to sell apps and so forth. The unemployment of humans can be compared to the unemployment of horses. As you know, this is Vasily Leontiev's famous argument from the 1970s. When steam engines were invented, some early forecasters in the 1830s said, well, it's curtains for horses. Horses won't have any jobs. But it turned out horses got more and more jobs for the next 100 years almost, because although there was work done by steam trains and by paddle ships, you needed horses to take people and goods to the railway stations and to the steamships. And futurists in the 1870s said it's only a matter of time. Eventually there'll be no jobs for horses, but the equivalents of yourself in the 1870s, here I'm quoting again from Robert Gordon, when she shared some of this information, said, there are plenty of arguments as to why we're always going to need horses. These horseless carriages, they're too heavy, they're too much of a fire risk, they're too noisy, they emit too much smoke, they're never going to be available to come into the cities. And in 1903, the famous photograph of the Easter Parade in New York, there were horses and carriages everywhere, and only one weird horseless carriage there. But just within 10 years later, it was completely reversed because Henry Ford had figured out how to manufacture enough, and horses went downhill fast from there. So I'm pushing this counter-narrative that just because it's been delayed, it doesn't mean it's not going to happen. My view is that, as some of the other questions have raised, these systems are going to become more flexible. Currently, employers may ban you from using ChatGPT at work, but there's going to be new versions of LLMs that don't have these privacy-leaking systems. So that's my counter. I wonder what's your view on Daniel Suskind's argument, because he explains it in 400 pages, and I've only done it in about 2 minutes just now.
Yeah, I gave a talk with Daniel in Trento a few months ago, and I honestly, I've been talking to him, I felt like he, like a lot of people in this space, have really moderated their claims. I feel like, the answer I want to give you is, I want to just leave him to the mic and say, sir, human beings are not horses. Because, that's the thing, is like a lot of the things that are eradicated are tools or animals which have very specific sets of capabilities that can then be overtaken. But human beings, it's still the case that their incredible flexibility is the key. But again, I don't know. I mean, look, like, people sometimes make fun of Paul Krugman, because in the early 90s, he famously said, I don't know if the internet is going to make a big difference, whether it will be more important than the fax machine. And it's totally true that the internet has changed our lives, smartphones have changed our lives. But if you look at the productivity statistics, it's actually true that the era of the fax machine made a huge, that era, not due to the fax machine, but the 80s were a period of just much higher productivity growth than the era of the smartphone. So smartphones have changed our lives incredibly, but they haven't delivered the gains in terms of productivity that are promised for them, even a long time after they've been introduced. And of course, there's a lot of reasons for that, which we talked about a little bit yesterday. There's a lot of ways that if you just walk around the world, you'll notice that smartphones have they're incredibly distracting. And they, the main thing, I still think Gary Marcus, he's someone who's, again, not sure what to think about the present wave of change. But when he wrote his book, Rebooting AI, which I still think is the best book on the topic, he said, look, what we need, what's happened over the last 20 years is that we suffer from information overload. The amount of information that our society produces is incredible. And one real danger of these technologies that we'll start to see soon, and we're already seeing, is the amount of scam emails you're going to get that are a little bit better, the amount of just totally junk interactions you're going to have with chatbots. The way these technologies are going to be used as tools of distraction and avoidance of work are going to be so much more extreme than anything we've seen so far, and the capacity of our society to adapt to that is probably very low. Now, what you should be looking for is a device that enables you to finally overcome that information overload. A personal assistant that will read all of your emails and respond to them, that will, answer questions for you, that can actually analyze what's scam information and what's true. One day we might get the personal assistant that actually allows us to deal with the information age. But so far, what we've gotten are tools that increase the degree of that information overload and distraction. We haven't yet gotten a device that allows us to actually control that. And you all know this as academics. You know that you spend more of your time answering emails, filling out questionnaires, being distracted by social media, that's the reality of your life, that these things are having a very ambiguous effect on your productivity. And that's true everywhere. Just look at all the people. I always ask my students, raise your hand if you're addicted to your phone. 100% of them raise my hand. I raise my hand because these things have had massively negative effects on our productivity. So I think, again, just with Gary Marcus, the gold, the compass is have we yet invented the technology that allows us to contain and control those things? We haven't done it yet. Might it happen? Maybe. And if it does happen, that will probably, generate some real gains. But again, I don't think that humans will go the way of horses, at least not yet. In my book, I should say, I'm very positive about a lot of these dreams of post-scarcity. I'm writing a book about post-scarcity economics. I think that the fantasy that technology will deliver us to a world of plenty, and then the question is, will it be a dystopia or a utopia, is an incredible science fiction genre device that helps us think about our present. And, I'm not an anti-technology person. I think we can use the technologies we're developing to build a much better world. I think that one of the big problems is that a lot of the ways we're using technologies, we're constrained to develop technologies in ways that are meant to increase productivity. But actually, these technologies can be used in really incredible ways to improve the way we use our free time, to enable people to connect with each other differently, maybe to improve the sustainability of our systems. And there's real limits to, when we talk about the technological determinism, there's some truth to that in capitalist societies, that technologies develop down very limited pathways. And I think that with some imagination and with social changes, we could really imagine technologies being used in a much broader, to realize a much broader array of goods and gains for our well-being than ones that the economists generate.
Great, so on that positive note, I think it's time for lunch. So let us thank Aaron for